A simple kidnapping was not a crime. It was a message sent by someone powerful enough to silence an entire city. The night began like any other in a quiet American suburb, somewhere between Chicago's edge and New York's forgotten blocks. Streetlights flickered softly over empty roads, and houses sat in their usual rhythm of dim windows and locked doors. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing ever does before everything changes. Inside one of those houses, a young man lived an ordinary life that had never attracted attention. He was not rich, not powerful, not dangerous. Just someone who believed that staying invisible meant staying safe. His evening had been normal. A half-finished meal, a phone screen glowing in the dark, and the comfort of routine. Until the sound outside stopped being normal. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. There were no screams, no crashing doors, no warning signs that movies always promised. Just the soft closing of a car door that didn't belong to anyone in the neighborhood. Then another. Black SUVs lined the street without headlights flashing or engines revving aggressively. They arrived like they had permission to be there. No chaos, no panic, only precision. The man barely had time to react before the door to his home opened. Not broken, not forced in a violent way, but unlocked with quiet certainty, as if whoever entered already owned the space. Two men stepped inside. They didn't rush. They didn't shout. They didn't explain. That was what made everything worse. The young man felt something shift immediately. This was not random crime. There was no desperation here, no messy robbery, no impulsive violence. Everything felt organized, rehearsed, like a procedure rather than an act of aggression. One of the men glanced at him briefly and said only one thing into a small earpiece. A single code phrase. The kind that doesn't belong to street criminals. It belonged to systems. As he was guided outside, he noticed the silence of the street had changed. Even the neighborhood dogs were quiet. No neighbors came out. No windows opened. It was as if the entire block had been instructed not to exist. Inside one of the SUVs, he saw a symbol etched into a metal tag hanging from the seat frame. Clean, minimal, unmistakably intentional. He didn't recognize it fully, but his body did. Fear responded before logic did. Because symbols like that didn't belong to criminals. They belonged to ownership. That was when it hit him. This wasn't kidnapping for money or revenge. It was selection. Somewhere in the city, someone had chosen him. And cities didn't argue with people like that. As the SUV door closed, the world outside felt strangely calm again. Almost normal, like nothing had happened at all. But then, through the tinted glass, he saw something that broke that illusion completely. A figure standing in the darkness near the last vehicle. Someone he knew. Someone from his past. And they were watching him like this had all been decided long before tonight ever began. The man behind the kidnapping was not angry. He was calm, as if destruction was just another routine business decision. In a high-rise office far above the sleeping city, Donovan Vale watched the operation unfold in real time. The room around him was designed like a financial war chamber. Dark glass walls, muted lighting, and multiple silent screens feeding him live feeds from different locations. Nothing in the space felt emotional. Everything felt engineered for control. Donovan did not speak immediately. He rarely did. He studied instead. Every detail of the footage from the SUVs. Every movement of the captured man. Every angle of the operation that most people would call a crime. But in Donovan's world, it was simply execution of intent. A subordinate stood nearby, waiting for instruction. He did not ask questions. No one around Donovan asked questions unless they wanted their position replaced. Donovan Vale was not feared because he was loud. He was feared because he never needed to be. In the criminal underworld, men built reputations through violence. Donovan built his through predictability. If he said something would happen, it already had. People were just waiting for reality to catch up. That was why police avoided pursuing him directly. Not because they lacked evidence, but because evidence had a habit of disappearing before it became useful. Cases collapsed. Witnesses changed statements. Entire investigations dissolved into procedural errors that no one could trace back to a single cause. Donovan did not fight the system. He quietly occupied it. Judges made decisions that aligned with unseen pressure. Business leaders shifted markets without knowing why. Political figures passed laws that conveniently protected interests they never openly acknowledged. And through all of it, Donovan remained a rumor wearing a human name. On the screen, the captured man was transferred from one vehicle to another. No aggression, no chaos, only precision. That was the signature of Donovan's operations. Nothing unnecessary, nothing emotional, nothing visible beyond what was required. A second feed opened beside the first. The controlled facility. Cold lighting. Concrete symmetry. No markings that revealed ownership. Even the architecture felt temporary, as if the building itself was designed to erase memory of its purpose. The victim was led inside. Still no struggle. Not because there was trust, but because resistance had already been calculated as irrelevant. Donovan leaned slightly forward for the first time. Not out of concern. Out of recognition. This wasn't random, one of his men said carefully. Donovan's gaze stayed fixed on the screen. Nothing ever is. The room went quiet again. Even silence around him felt structured. The truth was simple. The kidnapping was not a mistake, not a reaction, not a crime of opportunity. It was a message. And messages were Donovan Vale's preferred language. He finally spoke, voice low and precise. The subjects saw something they were not meant to interpret. Then almost clinically. So now they will learn what interpretation costs. On the screen, the victim looked up toward a hidden camera, instinctively aware that someone powerful was watching from the other side. That awareness triggered something deeper than fear. Triggered understanding. Donovan's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "Bring them closer," he ordered calmly. A beat of silence followed. Then he added, softer but far more final. "They already know too much." The kidnapping was not the beginning of chaos. It was the result of a hidden war already in motion. In systems like this, violence was never the first move. It was the last translation of decisions already made in silence, by people who never appeared in the same room, never raised their voices, and never allowed their names to exist in the same sentence. Donovan Vale understood that better than anyone. From his private control floor above the city, he reviewed a layered map of connections. Financial streams, police jurisdictions, political appointments, corporate ownership lines. Nothing on the surface looked illegal. That was the point. Power never survived by breaking laws openly. It survived by rewriting what laws could see. The victim, still contained in the facility, was no longer being treated as a person. They were now a node, an intersection point in a chain of events that stretched far beyond a single kidnapping. Because the truth was beginning to surface. Not loudly, not publicly, but dangerously. A piece of evidence had been moved outside its intended chain of custody weeks earlier. A witness statement that should have been erased instead survived in fragments. A financial transfer that was supposed to remain buried had left a trace inside a corrupted archive. And somehow, all of it pointed back into Donovan's world. But not directly at him. At something inside his structure. That was what made it unstable. Betrayal. Inside his circle, someone had begun feeding information outward. Carefully, selectively, like bleeding a system instead of breaking it. Not enough to expose everything. Just enough to create pressure points. Donovan did not react emotionally. He never did. But the room around him changed anyway. Subtle shifts in movement. Security repositioning without instruction. Phones being checked without being used. Even silence felt tighter, as if everyone in the building had suddenly remembered they were replaceable. A man stepped closer, hesitating before speaking. "We traced the leak directionally, but it keeps changing source." Donovan did not look up. Because it's not one source. That was the problem. Rival factions had been suspected before, But this pattern was different. It was not external aggression. It was internal fragmentation. Something inside his own network was cooperating with something outside it. The victim, unaware of the full scope, was now only partially afraid for themselves. That was new. Fear had evolved into something heavier, awareness that their survival was no longer the central issue. If they disappeared, the system would continue. If they spoke, the system might fracture. If they lived, they might become evidence. That was the real trap. Not captivity, but relevance. Donovan leaned back slightly, eyes fixed on shifting data feeds. They were never targeting the subject, he said quietly. They were testing the structure around them. Then the realization settled deeper. This kidnapping was not leverage against one person. It was pressure applied to an entire network. Inside the facility, the victim began to understand something they were never meant to understand. They were not inside a crime scene. They were inside a calibration test for something far larger, an adjustment of power between systems that had already been fighting long before they were taken. A war that did not announce itself with explosions, only with disappearances. Donovan finally stood, adjusting his cufflinks with controlled precision. "Find the traitor," he said. But even as the order left his mouth, the building's security systems emitted a soft, almost imperceptible change in tone. A new signal. Unregistered. Unauthorized. A warning. Then the alert flashed across every screen in the room. Intrusion detected. Private location breach in progress. And for the first time, Donovan Vale did not speak immediately. The most dangerous enemy was not outside the room. It was the person who opened the door. The intrusion alert had barely finished flashing across the control systems when the entire building shifted into silent protocol. Doors locked without sound. Elevators froze between floors. Security feeds began to fragment, not from failure, but from deliberate interference. Someone inside the system was already ahead of them. Donovan Vale stood still in the center of his control room, watching the screens flicker like dying signals. His expression did not change, but the atmosphere around him did. Men who had worked under him for years suddenly stopped making eye contact. Not out of confusion, but out of realization that something foundational had cracked. Trust. Because systems could survive attacks, but they could not survive doubt. A lieutenant stepped forward, one of Donovan's most trusted. The man who had stood beside him through years of operations, silent negotiations, and unseen executions. He spoke carefully, almost too carefully. "Sir, we're losing internal access. It's not external hacking. It's authorization level override." Donovan finally turned his head slightly. Not fully. Just enough. That was worse. Because it meant he already understood. Across the city, inside the controlled facility, the victim noticed the change too. The guards were no longer coordinated. Their movements carried hesitation. Instructions were being repeated twice before execution. Something invisible had entered the structure and started rewriting certainty. And in systems like this, hesitation was the first sign of collapse. Because in organizations built on control, the moment orders stop feeling absolute, power starts dying quietly. Back at the top floor, Donovan's gaze shifted toward the lieutenant again. "Run it back," Donovan said calmly. But the systems did not respond. That was the answer. A betrayal inside his own inner circle had already rerouted access keys, disabling segments of surveillance, unlocking restricted routes, and exposing internal corridors that should never have been visible. The lieutenant's hand tightened slightly, just for a fraction of a second, but Donovan saw it. Everything else became irrelevant after that. The realization did not arrive with anger. It arrived with confirmation. "You didn't just lose access," Donovan said softly. "You handed it over." The room went still. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. Because now it was no longer about an intrusion. It was about placement. Someone had opened the door from the inside. And that meant the enemy was already walking through areas they were never supposed to reach. Inside the facility, The victim noticed something else. An unlocked panel near the wall, slightly ajar, as if someone had deliberately left a gap in the structure. Escape was possible, but nothing about it felt safe. Because in a controlled system, anything left open was usually a trap designed to test desperation. Donovan's eyes returned to the main feed just as half the screens flickered out completely. Then the lights in the building stuttered once. It died. For half a second, there was nothing but darkness across every level. Gunfire erupted from another floor. In a place designed to trap people forever, freedom suddenly appears, but only for someone who survives long enough to reach it. The gunfire did not stop the system. Fractured it. Within seconds, the controlled facility that once operated like a sealed organism began to behave like something wounded. Lights failed in alternating sections. Emergency protocols activated without confirmation. Doors that were meant to remain sealed for hours suddenly released under corrupted authorization codes. And for the first time since the kidnapping began, the structure stopped feeling absolute. Started feeling breakable. Inside the containment corridor, the victim stood frozen for only a moment longer than necessary. Every instinct screamed that movement meant danger. But stillness was no longer safety either. Somewhere deeper in the building, voices shouted in clipped urgency. Footsteps moved in unpredictable patterns. The system was no longer coordinated, it was reacting. And reacting systems could be exploited. That was the moment survival changed its shape. Not from endurance. Timing. The victim moved. Carefully at first, then faster as the hallway lights flickered again. Security doors that once required biometric clearance now hung half unlocked, as if whoever controlled them no longer had full authority, or no longer cared. Because when control systems begin to collapse, even fear starts behaving like opportunity. Above the chaos, Donovan Vale's response remained unreadable. Some feeds still functioned. Others were blacked out completely. The lieutenant who had spoken earlier was no longer visible on any camera. That absence was louder than confirmation. It meant internal structure was actively being rewritten in real time. A rival faction was no longer a theory. It was inside. And worse, it was coordinated. Outside the facility, the city itself began to feel the disruption in indirect ways. Police communication channels experienced unexplained interference. Patrol routes were rerouted without command. Emergency response systems delayed by seconds that did not make sense on paper, but meant everything in execution. Something large was moving underneath the surface of normal life. The victim reached a junction point where 3 corridors split in different directions. For the first time, the building's architecture felt unfamiliar even to those trapped inside it. Signs flickered between operational and corrupted states. One direction led deeper into controlled zones. Another led toward maintenance access. The third, barely lit, suggested external exit routing. Escape was visible now. But visibility was not reassurance. Because nothing in this system offered freedom without cost. Every step forward carried the same question. Was this an opening or a guided mistake? Behind them, distant gunfire echoed again. Closer this time. More structured. Less chaotic. As if 2 organized forces were now colliding inside the same space, each trying to seize control of a system that was already breaking apart. The victim chose the corridor marked Exit Access and moved quickly, breath tightening, thoughts collapsing into pure survival logic. No trust, no certainty, only movement. The hallway ended in a reinforced door that stood slightly ajar, spilling faint white light from the other side. For the first time, it looked like the outside world might actually exist beyond the structure. The victim pushed through. Cold air hit immediately. Freedom, unfinished, unstable, real. And then the body froze. Because standing directly in front of the exit, unmoving and silent, was Donovan Vale, waiting as if he had been there the entire time. The kidnapping was never about punishment. It was about protection disguised as cruelty. The moment the victim saw Donovan Vale standing at the exit, everything they believed about escape collapsed. Not because the exit was blocked, but because it had always been under observation. The silence around him was not empty. It was controlled, measured, waiting. Donovan did not move toward the victim. He did not need to, because movement would imply uncertainty, and Donovan Vale never operated inside uncertainty. Inside the fractured facility behind them, systems were still collapsing in layers. Gunfire continued somewhere deeper, but it no longer felt like chaos. It felt like two separate authorities colliding over ownership of the same hidden structure. A war that the victim was never meant to witness, yet was now standing at the center of. And then the truth began to surface, not through explanation, but through alignment. This was never a standard kidnapping. It was interception. The victim had been marked long before tonight, not by Donovan's organization, but by something older, quieter, and far more coordinated. A convergence of political protection networks, military-grade intelligence contractors, and independent enforcement groups operating outside visible law. The kind of system that does not eliminate threats publicly. It erases them silently. The victim had unknowingly crossed proximity with information tied to that network. Not intentionally, not knowingly, just by existing too close to the wrong sequence of events. A fragment of evidence. Secondary witness trail. A trace connection that should have been erased but wasn't. That was the error. And errors in that world were not corrected. They were deleted. Donovan's intervention had not been an act of dominance. It had been containment. A controlled removal from a kill chain that the victim never even knew was active. The kidnapping, the isolation, the silence. It was all designed to break tracking continuity. To make the victim untraceable long enough for a larger strike against them to fail. Hook. Because in systems like this, survival is not granted. It is temporarily borrowed from something more lethal waiting in the background. The victim's breathing grew uneven as understanding arrived in fragments. Not relief. Not safety. Something worse. Conflict. If Donovan was the protector, then why did it feel like imprisonment? If he was the enemy, why had no one else arrived yet? Above them, Donovan's gaze remained fixed. Not on the victim but beyond them. Past the exit. Past the building. Toward something unseen. A distant shift in his expression confirmed what the victim could not yet see. The real threat was still active. Still targeting. Still closing in. Then, without warning, a faint red dot appeared on the victim's chest. A sniper laser. And somewhere outside the frame of visible reality, an unseen trigger had already locked onto its next moment. The same man who destroyed lives became the only reason one life survived until sunrise. The sniper's red dot held steady on the victim's chest for only a fraction of a second before the world shifted again. Not slowly. Not predictably. Instantly. Donovan Vale moved. Not toward the victim, but into alignment with the threat. The silence outside the facility broke open as unseen shooters revealed themselves across adjacent rooftops and shadowed structures. The night that had once felt controlled now fractured into layered violence, precision fire answering precision fire. This was not chaos. It was structured elimination. And Donovan was at the center of it. Somewhere deeper in the city's hidden network, rival operators had initiated full engagement. Not street-level criminals, but coordinated units designed for removal operations. Trained, funded, and deployed to erase targets without leaving narrative traces. But Donovan Vale was not a target. He was an obstacle. The first exchange of fire lit up the perimeter in brief, violent bursts. Yet even in conflict, Donovan's presence did not change. He remained controlled, calculating, redirecting his forces with minimal motion, as if every decision had already been rehearsed in a different timeline. The victim, still frozen near the exit, realized something critical. The attack was not random. It was synchronized. Which meant the earlier protection had already been compromised. Hook, because in wars that are never officially declared, the battlefield is not where people fight, it is where information collapses. Donovan stepped between the victim and the direction of incoming fire without hesitation. A gesture so precise it felt less like protection and more like correction. His remaining loyal operatives repositioned rapidly, forming a shifting perimeter that kept collapsing and rebuilding as pressure increased from multiple directions. Inside the fractured facility, internal betrayal still echoed through compromised systems. The lieutenant who had opened the breach was no longer visible on feeds. That absence confirmed what Donovan already understood. The internal structure had been partially handed over, not just hacked. It had been sold. Despite this, Donovan did not retreat. He recalibrated. And in doing so, he made a decision no one in his organization expected. He reduced his own operational exposure. Power nodes shifted away from him. Command authority temporarily rerouted. Strategic visibility narrowed. For the first time, Donovan Vale allowed himself to become less central, sacrificing control density to prioritize survival of the single variable he had now anchored everything to. The victim. Above them, distant sirens began to cut through the layered noise of gunfire. Not immediate. Not fully engaged yet. Law enforcement presence was approaching, but not fast enough to understand what they were walking into. Donovan glanced once toward the victim. No reassurance. No emotion. Just confirmation. And for the first time, the victim understood fully. They were not being saved because they mattered. They were being saved because they were already inside something larger than morality. As dawn began to threaten the edge of the skyline, the conflict abruptly shifted. Not ended, redirected. External attackers began pulling back, not defeated, but reorganizing. Like a system retreating to reevaluate failure. Donovan turned away. Not from the battle. From the role. And then, as suddenly as he had become visible in their life, he was gone, either swallowed by the collapsing structure or taken by the same silent system he controlled. The victim stood alone as the final echoes of violence faded into distance. Alive. But changed. Later, when the world finally stabilized enough to feel real again, a single encrypted message arrived on their device. No sender. No trace. Only a line of text. This war was never finished. And below it, a single classified file tag. The real mastermind. Status, not found.